You know I want to talk to Paul in England. I
Let's
totally do. Paul in England. You're live with Eric and V.
Hey.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Good, good. So, you wanted to talk about the cosmological argument?
Yeah, a cosmological argument, and also about the definition of atheism.
Cool. Okay. I don't know how much meat there is on the bone for the definition of atheism.
Unless you've got a cool new one.
Yeah, this is one that I haven't heard before, at least.
Oh.
So basically, most people would define atheism in today's day and age as a lack of belief in God/gods. Would you agree?
No.
Or is that just agnostic atheism?
Well, so specifically the way that I use atheism, it's the rejection of the assertion. So if you were to assert that a all-powerful God exists, I reject that assertion. There is my atheism. If someone were to bring me, you know, a mug of coffee and say, "Hey, Eric, this is God," well, I can't say that, you know, language changes. It always does. It's going to be different in 100 years than it is today. And if somebody says this coffee is God, then I go, okay, well, then obviously that exists. I think it's a poor definition for God. But for me to blanket say out no gods exist, then I'm setting myself up for failure. Do you see what I mean? If somebody were to say like, hey, God is just like the universe, man, then I got to go, okay, it's a weird definition for God, but I'm not an atheist about that one. Like, okay. So the crux there is one that's really important to point out.
Yeah. So basically, if a theist was to try and provide evidence for a God, and they didn't just merely assert it, but let's say they chose the ontological argument or maybe some modal argument, that wouldn't be an assertion. It would actually be at least an attempt to provide evidence for a God. And considering most of the time, even when you talk to theists, they still at least attempt to provide evidence, even if it's just like, I don't know, look around you, or, you know, look at the beauty in the world. Even if it's a somewhat poor argument, they will still attempt. Yeah, something like that. But it would, like most theists wouldn't just attempt to just assert something like that. Like,
you'd be surprised.
They would at least attempt to provide evidence. No, I mean, like, they would at least like attempt to provide evidence.
Oh, as somebody who's done this show for several years, you would be surprised. But we want to know about Paul. Paul, we want to know about you. You want to give us an argument for the existence of God that would be convincing or that provides evidence for that God's existence. I'm interested in hearing it.
Well, I quickly just wanted to finish off the atheism having a burden of proof, or at least agnostic atheism. Yeah. The way I've heard others, like, for example, maybe like Dillahunty or maybe some of the other people in the atheist experience, they've said, which is what I was expecting you to say, that atheism, or at least agnostic atheism, is a lack of belief in God/gods. In other words, that they have yet to been convinced by any theistic argument that God exists. Therefore, they stay impartial.
I'm definitely different because I'm very, very partial where it counts. If somebody makes a claim that is obviously false, I don't need to remain impartial about it, right? If somebody were to say that, they were all powerful, then I'd say, cool, open this jar of pickles. You know, if they can't do it, then I could probably argue that that's not a good claim, right? I'm not going to shy away from that. It's the rejection of the assertion. And that's why we have this show, so we can listen to those assertions.
All that I would say about being an atheist is that I have yet to be convinced about any particular God. I have heard of many, some more than others. None of them have convinced me yet. I don't see it as a lack, and I certainly am not impartial.
Okay. So if you were to say that you lacked belief in a God, it seems like a safe position to hold, as you don't appear to have a burden of proof. But if you look closely, and you would realize that there are actually two forms of agnostic atheism. At least that's the way I see it, because on one hand, you have, for example, a newborn baby. Yeah,
Hey, Paul. Since neither of us
Yeah,
have the
hey.
opinion that that fits,
Yeah.
we would need to be taking on a position that from somebody else, and I don't feel comfortable with that.
Okay,
But
yes.
I'm happy
I'll just get to
moving
the
on.
cosmological one.
Yeah, sounds
That's
good.
fine. Okay, that's fine. So my cosmological argument, basically, the first, I won't put it in premises, but basically, there has to be a sort of first, like, explanatory cause for everything. And the reason for that is, so basically either there's an infinite regress of events, or there is a first cause. And an infinite regress of events is absurd, so therefore there must be a first cause.
So hold on.
There are actually quite a few different understandings of the universe, both using Big Bang theory and not using Big Bang. For example, steady state suggests that the universe just, expands and contracts and has always been and will always be, and we are experiencing a particular part of that expansion. That has not been borne out as far as the science goes, but that's an option there. It's not an either or. There's another that says that maybe the Big Bang is the point in which it's fanned out that way, but it actually fans out the other way as well. So there's nothing beginning about the Big Bang. If anything, it's in the middle. So I'm not saying that any of these are particularly convincing or the one that we should be, taking on as true. What I'm saying is that the desire to make it into a dichotomy of either this or that, and therefore this one makes more sense to me, so it makes it more likely, is so wrong on so many levels, not only because we have so many different versions of how the universe could have started or not started, but also all of those defy common sense and our linear way of looking at time and experiencing time and space. So using common sense as it makes more sense to me, therefore it might be more true, is a really bad way of looking at this at all.
Okay, so first of all, this argument, it doesn't really have that much to do with the universe, contradictory to it being called a cosmological argument, because I'm not arguing, I'm not saying that that the universe, yeah?
I just want to make sure, it didn't sound like you were responding to V, and so I just want to make sure you're not on a script and we're talking to each other and having a conversation.
Yeah. We are. The argument isn't about the Big Bang. It isn't about there being a cause for the universe. It's for there being a cause for all that could ever be, which is why I said that there must be a first explanatory cause. So I'm saying that for all things that could possibly be, there must be a first cause for all of them. That includes any multiverses, that includes any form of cosmology that you may subscribe to, steady state, asymptotically static universes, any sort of universe that you may think of, whatever, however reality may have been, it must have a first cause, essentially.
Okay.
And obviously I would need to provide evidence for that.
Yeah, so
yeah, well,
there are a couple of pieces there. So this is a first mover argument, which is, but it's good to make sure that we're
first mover, yeah.
There are variations of the cosmological argument. So if we're going with that first mover, there are a couple of problems. Number one, time is necessary for events to happen. Is that controversial at all?
That is true.
Okay. So can an event happen without time?
No, an event cannot happen without time.
Okay. So if you believe that the universe was created, that is an event. And if in that universe, time was what existed in that universe, and you cannot have universe without time, those things are inextricably linked, how can a God create anything when there is no time?
Well, that was a bit further on in the argument, but I'll answer that. So if God created the universe, which I believe he most likely did, God would have been in a timeless state. And
what does timeless mean?
So So, in other words, it's a state of affairs sans time. A state of affairs without time.
Okay, I argue that does not exist at all. I don't even think that's a position you can put on the table.
Like, if we're worried about being realistic and not violating common sense by talking about, say, infinite regress, how on earth can we talk about timeless states?
I mean, do you think there was like a vacuum sealed God just kind of floating through until
you couldn't float? There's no space either,
and there's no time to float.
Yeah.
No, I think that's absurd on its face.
Okay, why do you think that's absurd?
Okay, so timeless. What is it?
For a thing to be timeless, it must be able to exist without time. Or if a state of affairs is timeless, then time isn't there. Like, okay. It isn't. It isn't simple.
Can you give me an example? Maybe we're just having some category issues, and I'm not understanding the subcategory that you're talking about. Give me an example of something that's timeless.
The first necessary cause of the universe would be an example.
No,
Obviously, I understand the structure. I know, but I would have argued towards that, to be honest.
Yeah. So I'm glad you bring it up, and I just want to bring that up for other people. When I asked Paul to give me an example, he pointed back to the example he's trying to prove. Paul, is there anything that has a timeless quality to it other than what you're trying to argue exists, so that I can maybe contextualize what you're talking about?
Numbers.
Okay. What about numbers?
Numbers are timeless.
Numbers are a concept. Is God just a concept? I mean, I'll give you that.
No,
I agree. We talk about God as a concept. Sure. It's an idea in the same way that any other fictional character is. But are you saying that there's some kind of... Numbers doesn't make any sense. Like, do you think that they're just kind of random ones?
Immaterial.
No, they're not. No, that's a category error.
This is my...
The category you're reaching here is things that exist as in physical material things. And instead, you're pointing to what we use to describe those things. Mm-hmm. So I don't, when I look at you, Paul, or when I talk to Paul, I'm talking to the one Paul that is on the phone. That is the number one assigned to you because there's one of you. That one is a descriptor. Those descriptors don't have thoughts. They don't have opinions, and they sure as fuck can't make anything. They're linguistic tools that we use to describe things.
Yeah. However, as I said before, I would have argued towards a timeless state, but you wanted to jump towards timelessness. So that isn't exactly an unbased. What's it called? It isn't exactly an assertion, because that's just, you basically just said, okay, let's just leapfrog part of the argument and let's get to there. So I would have argued for that.
You brought things up, and we usually go over a lot of the early stuff.
Right. We've heard many versions of the cosmological argument, especially first mover or first cause arguments. So we know where you're going. So we're just kind of making sure we're getting to the meat of it, where we normally hiccup, right? Which is, okay, I understand where you're coming from. You're going to go, well, God had to be timeless. He had to be spaceless, and he had to be personal. The only things that exist that are not God are either numbers or a mind, and numbers don't create things. So it must have been a mind. And I know this because every single person who has ever tried to get the Kalam to work has said this, because thank you, WLC.
Okay, for people who are watching, there's a lot of things we just referenced.
Sorry.
William Lane Craig is a popular Christian apologist.
I reversed Gish Gallop.
You really did.
That was bad.
What was described by V is the Kalam cosmological argument as talked about by William Lane Craig.
This isn't the Kalam cosmological argument. Yeah. This isn't the Kalam cosmological argument.
Okay.
This is
right.
The Kalam cosmological argument starts with a causal premise. This one is essentially says, if you let me finish the first premise more or less, that that there being an actually infinite regress of events leads to logical contradictions, not like Grim Reaper paradoxes or anything like that, but as in modal contradiction. So there must necessarily be a first cause.
Are you saying you're doing the modal ontological argument now, or are we still on cosmological arguments? Because those are different things.
Oh, people are probably wondering about that.
I always thought that whenever you talk about arguments that essentially argue for a first cause, considering that it involves the cosmos, because the cosmos is all of reality, even the parts that we don't know of yet, it would be cosmological anyway.
Okay. So here's the thing I picked up on just now, Paul. I love that you were super honest right then, and you said, well, I was taught that if I'm talking about this argument, then I also bring this argument to it. And being taught this stuff is great. Learning this stuff is awesome. What it sounds like to me is that you have a particular way that you've been taught to talk about this, and that's about as far as you've gone. You've learned the arguments, you've memorized them, you know that if this gets brought up, then I bring this thing up, but you might not know exactly why, and that's kind of coming through to me right now. So where did you learn this, if you don't mind me taking us on a little tangent right now?
I did have formal education in philosophy, and I've looked at philosophy in my own free time.
Okay.
So I don't want to take the conversation in an entirely different direction. So if there's anything else you want to do, or
Not really. I just that the phrasing of that kind of raised a little bit of a red flag for me.
Okay. So Paul, just to keep us on track here. We've talked about possible universes. We've thrown a lot of jargon around that a lot of people are probably scratching their heads about. And the goal of the show is to try and slow those things down so that we can bring people along for the ride with us. And a big piece of that a big piece of that is making sure that people get to see these conversations had. And people have talked about, people have called in, we've argued about the creation of the universe or possible creation of the universe. And there was a term that you'd used that I don't think has gotten a lot of love. And that term was timelessness. So is timelessness is that a quality that God has to have?
It would be. I'm just saying that everything is most likely good. Yeah.
Okay, so
yes, it would be.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, so I'm not without a belief on this one, and I'm not without I can actively tell you I reject soundly the assertion that a timeless being can exist. Not even what it could do, but that timelessness as a descriptor for something neuters it from being able to do the thing that you're saying it did. And so
so in other words, are you saying that because I'm positing a timeless entity, and yet you require time for change, it's a problem? In other words,
yeah, it is a problem.
Can I explain that?
And I have a burden of proof there, right?
Yeah. However, I still have my burden of proof because I was the one to say that this God is timeless. And
sure.
I still haven't provided any evidence for that because the argument hasn't really flowed well. But regardless, basically, as I said, there's either a infinite regress of events that would be time going back infinitely, and space as well, because of space-time, and then matter. That has to terminate at some point. You said that basically for all events, time must be essentially in the makeup of them. So time must always be there. But having an actually infinite regress, which is what time always being around would lead to, is would be like logically absurd. If you want, I can explain why. Because when I tried to explain this one before, you wanted to go straight to something else.
Sure. Well, because can I rephrase this to you and see if I'm on the same track as you?
Okay, then yeah.
Okay. So what you've done is you've presented a dichotomy, and the dichotomy is, and just for people who are watching who are wondering what the hell are we talking about, the cosmological argument for the existence of God doesn't bring up proofs for the Christian God or Muslim God or whatever, but it does kind of have this foundational creator entity that it's being argued for. And so this creator entity, using the cosmological argument, Paul is trying to assert that a creator had to kind of essentially get the ball rolling. And so when I asked Paul, I said, "Hey, Paul, how do you get there?" And he said, "You know what? I got to describe it." And so, Paul, what you did is you said we have two options: either time goes back infinitely, or it had to start somewhere. And if you knock one out because it's a dichotomy, the other one has to be true. And you're saying that time going back infinitely is absurd, which I'm assuming you mean also
it's absurd.
cannot be true. And
yeah,
so we're left
in any possible world, it cannot be true.
Okay. The possible worlds thing, no.
It's not how that works.
Yeah, let's not bring modal ontology into it, because that's an entire other layer that I promise you are not going to want.
I won't get too too technical with it. All it basically says is that that's basically, if you have like an infinite regress and there's members, like events within an infinite regress, each event would need to be like explained by another event. Like the present, like what's happening right now is being explained by what happened in the moment before. Mm-hmm. And for that moment before, what explains that moment is by what happened in the moment before that. So for each member, it could either be explained so that A would, so in other words, like A can explain B, and they can explain B like contingently or necessarily. So, but the thing is, if it goes back infinitely and you have an infinite amount of things explaining other things, then is that too technical?
No, but I think this is probably where we're going to, like, I want to respond to this, and then I want to make sure we have time for other callers. I could talk to you about this. Paul, I wish you were in Austin, Texas. I would personally buy beer, set up a 6-foot table that we can sit on either side of, and just talk about this for like a week. That said, that's really not what we can do on Talk Heathen. So here's what I want to leave you.
Then fair enough.
Okay. First off, you've been very respectful during this conversation. Really appreciate it. I love it. If it feels like we can move further in it. When you're talking about something being necessary and contingent, people tend to use those words around modal ontology, and it's not an exact fit, and there's a big problem there. So when something's necessary or possible, that's the dichotomy in modal logic.
Necessary and contingent.
Necessary and contingent. No, contingent is the ontology piece, or not the cosmological. God has to. Everything is contingent on something before it. Mm-hmm. That's different from possible in logic, in modal logic. And so if we switch between those, we get kind of confused. So, Paul?
Okay, I could just adjust it.
Sure. So, really quickly, is it possible in any possible universe, right? And this is just using logic, so I don't actually believe in multiple universes, but is there any possible universe that a God does not exist?
No, that's not possible.
Okay, if that's the case,
would exist necessarily.
Okay, so you're making the claim that God is necessary. I'm saying it's not even possible, and you're saying it's not only possible, but it has to be there. So you cannot possibly imagine any possible universe where there's not a God.
No, there isn't. There aren't any possible universes without a God.
Why?
I'd say that because, like, the thing is, okay, so this is right at the end of the argument. Basically, the argument for this God being personal. If you have two So basically, like, you have two necessary things. I'll change that. The necessary first cause can either be conscious or unconscious. If it's unconscious, it's just like an object. If it's conscious, then basically it can make a choice. If it was unconscious, the same way that whenever water goes below 0 degrees, it freezes without choice. It just does that. Then the universe itself would be as old as God. It would be eternal, because considering the fact that the first cause caused basically A, which is the first cause, caused B.
Paul,
it would exist as long as A existed. In the same way, yeah.
You're using a lot of language here that is adding to the complication in things. Eternal being one of them.
Okay, I'll simplify it then.
That's yeah.
Okay, I'll simplify it.
May I? I think what you're trying to say is you
yeah.
cannot have a universe without God, because only gods can create universes. Is that safe for me to say about
only God? No, because an eternal universe. A universe with infinite regress can't happen. And
I'm not talking about
was
that.
A unconscious thing.
Right. I'm specifically asking you the question. Yeah. I asked you, is it possible to have a God without a universe? You said it's not possible. And so I'm putting words in your mouth, and I'm trying not to. And so I want to ask you, because I don't want to straw man you before we move to the next call. Do you think that every possible universe has to have a God because only gods can create universes? That's the only way that universes happen?
Basically, yes.
Okay. And why do you think that?
Because God can make a choice.
Okay. Perfect.
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 Requires a choice.
Yeah. So there are so many places along the way here.
Like rubbish to everyone, but
yeah. Well, because especially if you're talking about choice, that means that God at most could possibly be in that universe. But if that God just didn't give a crap and didn't create a universe, then hey, there's your example of that not happening, right? Or that there's no naturalistic way for a universe to happen.
Yeah.
I think what you've done is you've defined your God into existence and then circled your way back around to it. And I'd love for you to.
I haven't really been given much time to make an argument, though.
No worries. But look at those ones in particular that's been, and then next time you call in, we are going to talk about Russell's paradox, because that is exactly, I love it. Paul, I hope you call back.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Bye. Hi.
The problem with modal ontology specifically is that they use a cosmological argument to pretend like they've established that such a God can exist in the first place. And then they plop that God into the modal ontological argument and say, well, if we take for granted that this God exists, these things need to happen in order to prove that this God exists. Mm-hmm. The problem is that they have not established any of that in the cosmological argument. So it's essentially just saying, I am going to decide that my God is necessary. And because my God is necessary, there can be no worlds without that God. Therefore, that God is necessary. It is a giant circle. No matter how many different ways you say it, no matter how many different arguments you slap together to make it sound more full of meaning, or it's the same argument over and over again, man. I don't know if I can do this anymore.
We have to. People are finding the show regularly, and it might be their first episode, it might be their 500th, but we want people to be able to see these conversations, have them had, and have them see them play out. And that's how we have to get there you're absolutely right. It is circular, and it's also ridiculous in 500 other ways, but that means we need 500 other calls so we can point out all those 500 other ways.
Also, here's the deal. If you're going to say, well, let's take for granted that we're both operating from this concept where common sense is paramount, and anything that violates common sense, like infinite regress, cannot be. Therefore, we need to even have this conversation in the first place, because we wouldn't even need to have this conversation in the first place otherwise. So if we're already coming from that place of, well, if it violates what we understand about the laws of physics and time and science, and we can't understand it, therefore it's false. You can't come at me with a timeless, spaceless being because that goes straight. Like, why is that
It's the
more
exact same
believable
argument. Yeah.
than infinite? I can say infinite regress. You can say timeless, spaceless being, and we're both going to just be button heads the whole time. And it's useless. It's useless.
It is, but I like being able to point out where it's wrong as well.